Okay, tonight chapter 24, and we're calling this waiting on. How many of y'all like to wait? Nobody. I don't see any hands. Oh, Bill likes to wait. Okay. All right, so let's start with chapter 24, verse 1 and 2. When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, "Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi." Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel and went to seek David and his men in front of the wild goats' rocks. So as we've learned through these chapters of Saul chasing David, that Saul is never without a scouting report. And we've also learned that David is never without a scouting report. So they're watching each other's groups because they want to know what's going on. It's interesting that Saul chooses to chase David with 3,000 of the best soldiers. You know, I'm sure his scouts have told him that David has 400. And actually, I think at this point he's actually increased to 600, we learned last chapter. So we have a 3,000 to 600 ratio, so a 5-to-1 ratio. I'd call that overkill, but Saul believes he's not going to take any chances on David getting away. Okay, verse 3. And he came to the sheepfolds by the way where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave. So as you've seen on the video, it's an area next to the Dead Sea that has lots of caves. And apparently a sheepfold is an area where they would keep the sheep, so apparently that was kind of below some of the caves, and there were springs of water. Now the Dead Sea obviously is very salty, you can't drink that, but there were some springs of water that they had access to for water. So what does it mean? Saul went into the cave. So this is a case where we've talked about before, when you're doing biblical interpretation, to read several versions. And we've said it if you have the Bible app on your phone, there's 72 English versions. So if you read several of those, you can kind of get an idea, because obviously we're not Hebrew scholars and we can't go back and see what the Hebrew meant. Some of the commentators think that this means Saul went in to use a restroom. Other ones will say Saul went into the cave to rest, because we know in that time of in that area in the desert, it can get to be 120 degrees. And so back in the caves was much cooler. So maybe he went in to rest and had some guards posted at the exit of the cave. I did look up the Hebrew. The Hebrew word here literally means to cover his feet. So personally, I think he went in to take an afternoon nap and probably took his robe off and put it beside him because he was hot. Anyway, so I think that's probably what's going on. But nevertheless, let's go on with the story in verse 4. And the men of David said to him, "Here is the day which the Lord has said to you, Behold, I'll give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you." Then David arose and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe. So David's men, they've been with him on this chase that Saul has been chasing him. They just, barely escaped several times, and they know that Saul is just out for blood. And so they really believe, they're believers. They believe that this is like a providence, that God has given Saul over into David's hand. And, he's alone, he's vulnerable. And so they're thinking this is David's great opportunity that God has provided for David to take the throne by killing Saul. So they're saying this isn't just a coincidence, because it seems so obvious. Now David, I think he probably finds himself tempted, because here's a guy who's absolutely made his life miserable for several years now. He's had to live on the run and just can't find a place to stay, because everywhere he goes, Saul finds out, and so he has to leave. So I'm sure he's tempted, but also he's conflicted. He knows that Saul has been anointed as the current king, and that's a God-appointed position. And so he's conflicted, so instead of killing Saul, he takes his knife and cuts off a piece of the kingly robe, the outer robe that signifies that Saul is the king. Okay, verses 5 through 7. And afterward, David's heart struck him because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing that he is the Lord's anointed." So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. So David's men are watching him sneak up and with a knife, but instead of killing Saul, he just cuts off a piece of his robe. And then David comes back, and he's upset. It says he's really upset. And so the men are thinking, what's going on here? And so they get confused. And so David is remorseful. They're remorseful that David didn't kill Saul, and so they're not happy. So verse 7 there, it says David persuaded. So again, if you look at several different versions, the Amplified Version says he strongly rebuked. If you go to the Hebrew, it says he tore apart his men. So in other words, they were rising up against David to say, okay, if you're not going to kill him, we're going to. We're tired of this chase that's gone on, it seemed like forever. We're tired of running from place to place to place. So if you're not going to kill him, David, we will. So David says he strongly rebuked. He tore apart his men. He said, back down. Back down. We're not going to kill Saul. He is the Lord's anointed. He's in a position that God's put him in. Yes, God's anointed me as the next king, but I'm not going to usurp Saul's position. It's God's place to put me as king. I'm not going to take a shortcut. I'm not going to take a shortcut. And now see, this is different than if they'd actually had a battle where Saul was armed and the two armies were going against each other. That would be a different thing. But here you have Saul's vulnerable. He's unarmed. And it wouldn't have been right for David to sneak up and kill him, because that would be taking a shortcut. And see, when we talk about waiting on God, that's kind of what we're getting at, is often it's difficult for us to wait on God, and so we try to find a way around that will speed up the process. We get tired of the situation we're in, whatever's going on, and we try to find a shortcut to try to help God out. So David is refusing to take a shortcut to help God out. Okay, verse 7b and 8. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went on his way. Afterward, David also rose and went out of the cave and called after Saul, "My Lord the king." And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the earth and paid homage. So Saul leaves the cave, and I'm sure David lets him get a little bit of distance, and then he shouts out, "My Lord the king." Now you remember David had married Saul's daughter Micah as part of the prize for killing Goliath. He'd been part of the king's court for some time. So you know that Saul knew David's voice. So here's Saul walking away, and he's just walking away from a cave, thinking that he just had a rest or a restroom, one of the two, having no idea that nobody was in the cave, and this voice comes from behind him, "My Lord, my king," and it's David's voice. And he hadn't actually heard David's voice probably about 5 years, but he knew it, just like we would know it if we'd known somebody for a long time and hadn't heard him for a while. So he turns around, and he sees David bowing to the ground. Okay, verse 9. And David said to Saul, so I'm sure David stands up and he's going to give his defense. David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of men who say, 'Behold, David seeks your harm'?" So he starts this really great speech, and he starts out by saying, "My Lord, my king." Then he courteously, David's being very courteous here, because deep down he knows Saul's heart is just crazy to kill him. but he courteously lays the blame for Saul's rage on evil counselors of Saul. So that's what he's saying is, why do you listen to the words of men who say, behold, David seeks your heart? So it's like he's off putting Saul's jealousy onto his advisors, even though deep down David knew that was not the truth. Verse 10, behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you today into my hand in the cave. And some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not put out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. So David tells how God allowed David tells Saul how God allowed him an opportunity to kill the king. And even his men were pushing him to do that. But David said, I am not going to kill you, Saul, because you are God's anointed. And basically he's saying, Saul, God put me to the test, and I passed the test. So what are you doing? Verse 11, see, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand. For I'm sure Saul, a king at that time had not noticed that a corner of his robe had been cut off in the cave. See the corner of your robe in my hand, for by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there's no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it. So here he calls him my father again, showing honor, and he shows him the piece of the robe, and it says, I'm blameless. I'm blameless. Here's the proof. Here's the proof. I'm not just saying this. I got close enough to kill you. Instead, I just cut off the corner of your robe. Verse 12. May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me against you, but my hand shall not be against you. So David here is showing no expectation that Saul will change his mind. But he's saying, Saul, I put my confidence in God. I can't put my confidence in you. You've shown over and over and over, even though you've shown remorse at times. You've shown over and over and over. You're not going to stop. But my confidence is in God, that he will make me king when it's his time, not my time. So he said, I have no plans to kill you. Verse 13. As the proverb of the ancients says, out of the wicked comes wickedness, but my hand shall not be against you. So this is not a proverb out of the Bible. It's apparently some saying they had back then. But basically it says, if someone's wicked, you can expect them to be wicked. Don't expect a wicked person to be good, to treat you good if they're a wicked person. If they are driven by evil, you have the expectation of evil from them. So he said, Saul, that's what I expect of you. I've seen that from you for all these years now that you've chased me. But he said, I am not wicked like you are. I am not going to harm you, even when God gives me the opportunity. Verse 14. For after whom has the king of Israel come out? After whom do you pursue? After a dead dog? After a flea? So David's saying, Saul, stop and think about what you, the king of Israel, has been doing now for 5 years. Instead of ruling this country, you've got this army of men you're chasing around the country. You're chasing one person who is not a danger to you. He's not trying to take your kingdom. Why are you doing this? And he says, what am I, a dead dog, a flea? Now, today, dogs are little precious pets. Or in Kathy's case, our precious cat is our precious pet. Right? Back then, dogs were not pets. They were not something you would keep in the house. Dogs were wild. They were scavengers. They were despised. They were flea-ridden. They were diseased. So they were just wild animals. So when David says, am I a dead dog? It's like, am I something you would despise? I mean, why are you chasing me? I'm not going to hurt you, Saul. Back in chapter 17, when Goliath and many years back, when David was young and fighting Goliath, remember Goliath said to David, "Am I a dog to you?" In other words, saying that is, it's a put down. It's a put down. And then what's worse than a dog is a dead dog. So a dead dog is totally despised and totally worthless. Another time that phrase comes up here in 2 Samuel, the next book, chapter 9. This is after David becomes king. And if you remember, he had promised Jonathan, Saul's son, that when he becomes king, he would not exact revenge and execution against Jonathan and Saul's family. And said, in fact, I will take care of them if they need to be taken care of. And sure enough, in chapter 9 of the next book, King David is seeking out any remaining living descendants of Saul and Jonathan, and he finds a lame son named Mephibosheth. And, being lame and disabled, again, disabled people back then were social outcasts because they could not contribute to society. And so when David brings Mephibosheth into the palace and feeds him, lets him be part of the royal family, Mephibosheth says to David, Mephibosheth describes himself as a dead dog. He said, "Why would you pay attention to a dead dog like me?" So a dead dog was a lowly thing, a very lowly thing. And then David adds, "I'm a dead dog, I'm a flea." He said, so it's like here you have the king of a country with 3,000 men chasing one flea. He said, "Saul, this is kind of ridiculous. That flea's not going to bite you. So why are you chasing a flea?" So David's trying to get him to see how totally ridiculous this whole thing has been. And so the bottom line is David is saying, "I am not worthy of your time. I'm not worthy of your attention. I'm not worthy of the expense to your kingdom that you're expending just chasing me around the country. So I'm not a threat to you. So why are you doing this, Saul?" And then verse 15, he finishes his speech. He says, "May the Lord therefore be the judge and give sentence between me and you, and see to it and plead my cause and deliver me from your hand." So Saul is saying, I'm not going to be David's saying, "Saul, I'm not going to be the judge over this situation. I'm going to let God bring the justice. I believe he will. I believe he has. I believe he will. And so I'm just standing back and I'm going to let God take care of this." Then he rests his case. Okay, let's turn to the back of your lesson sheet. So now Saul gives his response. Verse 16. As soon as David had finished speaking these words to Saul, Saul said, "Is this your voice, my son David?" And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. So, we said David was speaking from the mouth of the cave, so he may have been back in the kind of the dark area where Saul couldn't completely see him, but Saul could hear his voice. But he hadn't heard it for a few years, so he knew from that speech it was David. He knew from that speech. Who else would give that speech to him? And so Saul knew his voice because it was familiar. And just, that's a lesson for us, that we know the voices of those who are familiar to us. Somebody calls you on the phone. In the old days, of course, now you see on your cell phone. The old days when you had the old black telephone or whatever kind of phone you had on the wall, if you didn't have caller ID was a big deal when it came in. Before that, you didn't know who was on the phone. But you could tell by the voice of the person if it was somebody familiar to you. Anyway, so Saul is overcome with emotion and he starts crying. It says he starts weeping. So unfortunately, we've seen this before. A few chapters back, we saw exactly the same thing. Saul was overcome with emotion. Unfortunately, his weeping never really brought repentance. And maybe he was weeping here because he realized how close he came to dying. It could be he was just relieved that David didn't kill him after all. But our lessons here is that, we recognize the voice of those we know well. So as a child of God with the Holy Spirit within you, do you recognize the unctions, the push, the voice of the Spirit within you? If you don't, we need to get closer to God so that you recognize when you're getting those pushes, because those urges, those pushes, those voices of the Spirit will help lead us and guide us. I mean, that's one reason God has given the Spirit to us. And then the second lesson is what happened to Saul here. Is like many folks today, I've seen this and I'm sure you have too, that many folks when they hear the truth have an emotional reaction. But then unfortunately it doesn't really change their life. And the reason is because their old life never died. So there are folks that hear the gospel that are sorry, that are sad, but they go away and never change. And that's what happened to Saul. Verse 17 through 19. He said to David, "You are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil. And you have declared this day have you dealt well with me, in that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you've done to me this day." So Saul here is acknowledging, in this temporary bit of clarity that he has, acknowledging that David is a better man than he. He even calls him my son, and that's in response to David calling him my father. And then what Saul describes here is often how our reactions to others reveal our level of life. I think I put them on the lesson sheet. So these are kind of three basic levels of living life. One is the divine level. If you live life at the divine level, you return good for evil. If you live life at the human level, you return good for good, and you return evil for evil. That's the natural thing to do. And then if you live at the demonic level, those are the folks that return evil for good. And you can think of all the Christians and Jews that have been persecuted through the ages just because of their faith. And so the demonic folks are persecuting them and killing them. And here Saul is saying, David, you're living on the divine level because you're returning good for evil. I'm living on the demonic level because I'm returning evil for good. Okay, verse 20. And now behold, I know that you shall surely be king, and the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. So Saul openly confesses that he knew David would be the next king and that Israel would be stronger under his rule. Here's a quote I got from one of the commentaries, Ralph Davis. He said, "How can the words of David's enemy carry divine assurance to David?" In other words, why should David believe what Saul says? Doesn't the character of the speaker negate the truth of the message? He goes on to say, well, in Numbers 22, if God can speak through the jaws of Balaam's donkey, surely he can confirm truth through the lips of a deranged king. So it's kind of like when Jesus said, if they're not for us, if they're not against us, they're for us. And so, yes, there are people that are not really living the best life, whether they be leaders or just Christians, but they can still speak truth. They can still speak truth. So we don't need to totally discount things people say, even if they're not 100% the best person they can be. Okay, Saul continues his reply. Verse 21. Swear to me, therefore, by the Lord, that you will not cut off my offspring after me, and that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house. So Saul basically is saying, okay, I know God is on your side, David. I know how this is going to play out in the end. So my concern is my name and my family, my descendants. You know, the custom, we've talked about this before, the custom back then in the ancient times, even up until the Middle Ages, was if a new king came in power, he basically killed all the extended family of the previous king because he didn't want competition. And sometimes, even if it was a king's son that became king, he would kill all his brothers because he didn't want competition. So that was a very common thing back then. So Saul is telling David, okay, promise me this, that you'll not degrade my name, but also you won't kill my descendants when you do become king. Verse 22, and Saul swore this to Saul. David swore this to Saul. So David agrees he will not kill Saul's descendants. Then Saul went home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. So David swears to Saul he won't kill Saul's family when he becomes king, because David has faith that God will make him king and it will be without competition. He has such belief in God that he's not going to have to take the shortcut and kill any of Saul's descendants that are still alive. So Saul goes home. Now you think about this, he could have trapped David and his men in that cave with those 3,000 men. But he is having a temporary moment of clarity where he realizes that he needs to get on out of there. So he and his men go home. Matthew Henry commentary says Saul was convinced but not converted. So he was convinced for the moment, but we know from future chapters he's not converted to leaving David alone. And David, he knows Saul is not converted because they leave and go to another place. They go to another stronghold. And so we think that that's probably Masada, which is farther down the coast of the Dead Sea we showed you a while ago. So Ralph Davis says, to be reassured is one thing, to be stupid is another. David has no illusions as he watches Saul and his army leave. David wisely doesn't trust Saul. So he and his men go up to the stronghold, which we believe is Masada. And then the last quote here is from Warren Wisby in his commentary. It says, this is a tremendous lesson, this chapter. David has won many, many battles, but one of the greatest victories occurred in that cave when he restrained himself and his men from killing Saul. So the lesson here, David decided to wait on God. Even though he was presented with an opportunity for a shortcut, to help God out, to make things happen quicker. But he chose not to because of his belief and faith in God. Even though it seemed so easy. And his men were even telling him, God has provided this opportunity for you. This is God's providence. He just laid the king right down there. All you got to do is kill him. So you got a crowd behind you saying, this is God's providence. Go do it. But he chose to stand up against the crowd and believe, no, that's God's anointed. God anointed him as king. God has promised to be me the next king, but it's God's time, not my time. So how does David, this young David, he's probably in his mid-20s here, get such a strong faith in God that he can do that? I mean, that's tremendous. So again, in chapter we just read, we don't have his thoughts. These are just actions. We just read the story. But as we've said before in previous lessons, many of the Psalms that David wrote were during this time that Saul was chasing him. And sure enough, he wrote a psalm in the cave before this happened tonight. So sometime when he went into the cave, there's a psalm that he wrote. We call it David's journal, but it's Psalm 57. So this is before the event happened. This is before Saul ever came, but he reveals his thoughts and his faith and his beliefs, and it shows us why he was able to wait on God when it didn't seem like a good idea. So what I've done here is written down some ideas from that psalm. We're not going to read the whole psalm, But if you look in your Bible, if your Bible has headings on chapters, it's Psalm 57, they'll say, David in the cave when he fled from Saul. So this is the episode that we're talking about. So the first thing is verse 1 and 2. We're calling this sovereignty. Verse 1 and 2, have mercy on me, O God, have mercy. I look to you for protection. I will hide beneath the shadow of your wings until the danger passes. I cry out to God Most High, to God who will fulfill his purpose for me. Now I'm reading all of these verses from Psalm 57 on your lesson sheet are from the New Living Translation. It's one of the modern language translations, much like the NIV, the New International Version. It's one of my favorite, more modern translations for just getting a good flow of words that doesn't sound like the old King James. But you can see here, David is saying, I will cry out to God. Now, again, he's been running from Saul for 5 years. David knows that he's anointed the next king. But he says, I will cry out to God who will fulfill his purpose for me. Who will fulfill his purpose for me. Which means I don't have to help God out. I don't have to take a shortcut if I see one. And he's basically saying, I'm not sure how God's going to do it. I don't understand that, but I trust him to do it his way. His way and in his timing. So I will wait on him. So when we believe in the sovereignty of God, we believe that he has a purpose for our lives. And yes, we do what we can, but we don't shortcut God. We don't try to get ahead of God. We wait on him because we believe in his sovereignty, that he's our Lord, he's our master, he's our king. And so he has his hand on our lives. Verse 3 talks about God's faithfulness. He will send help from the heaven to rescue me, disgracing those who hound me. My God will send forth his unfailing love and faithfulness. You know, if you believe in the sovereignty of God, but not the faithful love of God, it's not a lot of comfort. One of the commentators was talking about how many Muslims believe in God's sovereignty, but they don't have this personal relationship with God. They don't really believe in God's love. He's sort of the bully in the sky. So they have this saying, it's called Insha Allah. And they say when they say this, it comes with a shrug. And basically what it means is, okay, if this is God's will, we'll just deal with it. In other words, this is not the actions of a loving, caring God, but it's, like a bully in the sky that, he's going to do what he wants to do, so we just got to deal with it. And so that's believing in the sovereignty of God, but not with the loving faith, the faithful love of God. So when my circumstances look bleak, what we need to do is remember to look at the cross, to understand that God's faithful love for you and for me came to us through Jesus on the cross. So that's why he sent Jesus, because he loves us. So it's not just, yes, he's sovereign, but he has a faithful love. So David's saying here, I can trust God and I can trust his purposes for me because I am convinced of his love for me. Okay, the next point is in verse 5, selflessness. Be exalted, O God, above the highest heavens. May your glory shine all over the earth. So this verse points out one of the big differences between Saul and David. All Saul can think about is himself. Why would you do what he's been doing? Because he's thinking about himself. His name, his reputation, his kingdom, his family, it's all about me. All about me. He's number one. But God, as you see this through David, David is not trying to exalt himself. He realizes it's all about God. Be exalted, O God, above the highest heavens. May your glory, not my glory, not Saul's glory. Yes, I'll be your king one day, but it's not about me. God, it's about you and your glory. And then the fourth point is confidence, verse 7. My heart is confident in you, O God. My heart is confident. No wonder I can sing your praises. So the word confidence can refer to our faithfulness, that David can be faithful towards God because he is confident in God's faithfulness to him. So one of the commentators said the backbone of our obedience is when we are confident in the faithful love of God. So when you put all this together, if we find ourselves in a situation that is uncomfortable, that we don't like, that we want to get out of, we want to take matters into our own hands, and we do it, it's because we failed in one of those four areas, one or more. If we find ourselves wanting to take matters in our own hand, it could be, number one, we don't really believe God is sovereign. He's not really in charge, doesn't really have a purpose for our lives, so we're going to take matters into our own hands and create our own purpose. Or number two, we're not convinced of God's faithful love for us, so if he doesn't really love us that much, we'll just kind of do what we want to. Or number three, we're selfish. We think life is all about me, so what I want is what I'm going to do, not depend on God to show me the way. Or number four, we're not really confident in our own faithfulness to God. We really don't have faith in God. So if we find ourselves in a situation where we're trying to shortcut and not wait on God, review these things, because there's something missing in our relationship to God, and it would revert to one of these four things. So stop and think if that happens to you. Okay, so as we finish, let's read this paragraph together. Our strength for waiting on God is found in the steadfast faithfulness of God, knowing he has my name engraved on the palms of his hands. That's Isaiah 49. Knowing he loves me to the point of having his son die for me. He knows my struggles, and he knows my true purpose. Probably the most famous verse in the Bible about waiting on God is Isaiah 40:31. Those who wait on the Lord. So I looked at the different translations there on my Bible app, and I really like the one from the Passion Translation because it makes it deeper. And that's what I've got on your lesson sheet there. What's interesting, it says, those who entwine their hearts with Yahweh. So the Hebrew word there for wait, those who wait on the Lord, is entwine, make a rope. Make a rope. So when you're making a rope, you're binding two things together. So waiting on God, what this means is waiting on God is not passive. We think of waiting as sitting back and doing nothing or playing on your phone or daydreaming. But that's not the idea of this verse. This verse says entwine your hearts with Yahweh, with God. So you're actively waiting on God. It's a binding of our hearts to God as we wait for his plans of our life to unfold. Let's read the verse. But those who entwine their hearts with Yahweh will experience divine strength. They will rise up on soaring wings and fly like eagles, run their races without growing weary, and walk through life without giving up. So let's wait on God. That's our lesson tonight. Thank you very much. So let's stand and we'll have our closing prayer. Thank you for being here. Thank you, visitors. Thank you all for coming to celebrate John's 90th birthday. That's awesome. Thank you, Lord, for this time.